Welcome everyone to this afternoon's London Art Week Art History in Focus talk entitled Framing Impressionism. I'm speaking a little slowly because the attendee figures are just going through the roof, so I'm very pleased. Everyone's logging in. I hope everyone can log in successfully and that the link has worked for everyone. And while everyone does so, I'm going to introduce the subject of today's talk. In the grand salon exhibitions of 19th century Paris, new paintings were judged against a hierarchy of genres, which started with history painting, drawing from the deep well of mythological literature and biblical parables. Below this was portraiture, followed by genre painting, landscape, and finally scenes of everyday life. To be considered acceptable as submissions to the salon, paintings had to be presented in fully gilded neoclassical and revival French Baroque frames of approved design, which was an expensive outlay for any emerging artist and a heavy-handed statement of civility, continuity, and order. Informed by modern science-led color theory and by the new visual ideas of the pre-Raphaelites and their circle, the Impressionists shook off the dusty conservatism of the early 19th century and sought to remake the relationship with the artwork between it, its frame, the viewer, and the space of display. Degas and Pissarro were key exponents of this new wave, developing complementary color combinations between painting and frame. Some of their own designs still survive, revealing how they dispensed with costly gold leaf in favor of plain or colored gessoed finishes, and introducing a broad visual pause between the paintings themselves and the heavy decoration of the surrounding architectural envelope. It wasn't always plain sailing, never is. Discovering that his dealer needed to appease the conservative tastes of his patrons, Monet combined motifs cherry-picked from 17th and 18th century frames with mouldings of a more subtle and suitable size, displaying his later paintings in linear garlands of leaves and architectural ornament. But alongside his fellow Impressionists, he successfully pulled apart the stuffy consensus surrounding the framing of pictures and pioneered an aesthetic sea change that has had long-lasting effects, some of which are still being unpicked and only begun to be understood fully today. With this in mind, I have great pleasure in introducing the three speakers of this afternoon's talk. We're joined by Lynn Roberts, an art historian specializing in the history of picture frames of all periods from the 13th to the 21st century. That's no mean feat. She's worked for Paul Mitchell Ltd, the National Portrait Gallery, and the National Gallery in London. She also founded and edits something that I would recommend everyone here reads from time to time, The Frame Blog, an online magazine devoted to the study of antique and modern picture frames. She's written numerous publications, several of which remain indispensable authorities on the subject. After reading architecture and fine arts degrees at Cambridge and the Courtauld while working in his father's Bond Street art dealership, Paul Mitchell took over responsibility for framing at the gallery. It's then that he began what has become the world's most authoritative photographic archive of pictures with original or contemporary frames in museums, galleries, and exhibitions worldwide. And he has really pioneered the way modern curators and collectors look at paintings and their frames together, and how we can reconsider frames as integral bearers of meaning for pictures on our walls. He's reframed paintings for many of the world's greatest private and public collections. And he's joined by Mark, who gained considerable experience in the family business while learning with his father and helping to build the company's library and photographic archive before joining Paul Mitchell Ltd full-time in 2004. Mark has held daily talks at the gallery, most recently during the company's exhibition Form and Function of European Picture Frames from the 15th to 20th century, which was held as part of London Art Week in 2023. And we're looking forward to what Paul, Mark, and Lynn all have to say this afternoon. So I'd like to hand us over at this point to Paul, who is going to start us off with the salon hang and salon frames in 19th century Paris. Paul, over to you.
The official annual art exhibition in France, the Salon, was the main cultural attraction of the year, where leading artists exhibited works for public display. Records show that between 1830 and 48, they could be expecting to see 1 million visitors a year. Critics, patrons, art collectors, art dealers, and artists attended. Works submitted were vetted by a jury. The artist would receive 1,000 francs if their painting was turned down, 2,000 if accepted for display, 3,000 for an honourable mention, and 5,000 if it won an award. Inclusion could make or break an artist's career. The Salon was where reputations were made and business done. Celebrated writers, including Stendhal, Baudelaire, and Zola, discussed exhibits in the art journals. Impressionist works were usually refused, and in 1863, the Salon jury rejected a high number of submitted paintings. To show that salons were democratic, Napoleon III instituted the Salon des Refusés, containing a selection of works recently rejected. It opened in the 17th of May, 1863, effectively marking the birth of the avant-garde. This paved the way for the Impressionists, who held their own independent exhibitions organized by the Société des Artistes Français. 8 were held between 1874 and 1886. Now, this photograph by Richebourg of the 1861 Salon shows how pictures were packed floor to ceiling, wall to wall. The jury stipulated section widths of mouldings, and that all had to be gilded. The patterns for economy were mainly straight-sided revival styles with continuous running mouldings made in plaster of Paris. Here we see 5 fluted scotia frames, which reinforce the illusion of perspective, providing a steady flicker of light surrounding the artwork. These are grouped in the bottom left-hand corner and over to the right. This type became a uniform collector's gallery frame, such as the Lavallard collection in Amiens. The oval portrait, a Louis XIII revival style, set on a rectangular back to comply with the regulations, is noteworthy as the bunched leaf pattern we shall see later in Monet's studio. The flower corner frame in the center recreates a popular Louis XIV design. Collectively, these were the approved salon settings preferred by dealers and collectors during the Second Empire. We shall now see 2 first-class examples of the salon frames created for works by Courbet and Manet in full Technicolor. Okay, next.
We've got that here.
Great. Sorry for the delay. This charming work by the Italian Enrico Meneghelli depicts the triple hang of paintings in the picture gallery in the Old Museum, Boston, a reminder of the salon installation seen previously, the close hang inevitable when space is at a premium, power of gilding to illuminating each work, the Courbet frame only done 22 years before. Its original frame, as we see on the right, is an extremely fine example of its kind, as seen in the salon. It has 3 notable features. The fluting in the deep hollow, as we said earlier, leads the eye into the subject via the broad double frieze into the avenue of trees. It has corner leaves, essential for covering the flute junctions, and emphasize the diagonal axis of the composition, which gives a Baroque sense of grandeur. The top edge of the frame has a ribbon and berry molding, creating a vibrant play of light, drawing attention to the whole subject. This is the silhouette of the frame, We shall shortly see Degas employs a ribbon in one of his own frame design for much the same reasons. Courbet was an avid hunter and set this scene in the Jura mountains of his native Franche-Comté region, near France's border with Switzerland. The artist portrays himself as a huntsman resting quietly against a tree, smoking a pipe. His gun hangs between him and his prize, rendered with care and a delicate naturalism. Courbet's roe deer attracted attention when he exhibited this painting at the Paris Salon of 1857. Gautier considered the animal irreproachable, one of the best things in the exhibition. He could feel the coat, its moist, glistening nose, yet a spatial disjointedness isolates the figures and animals from cohesively integrating, an effect caused by Courbet's additive process. We now move to the Manet Olympia. And this was indeed in the Salon in 1867. It is, by any standards, probably one of the finest examples of its kind ever made at the time. A spectacular example of frame-making skills in a Louis XIV revival form, befitting Manet's controversial subject. Note the precision molded oak leaves symbolizing strength, longevity, and endurance, and inner flowered strap work, a masterpiece of its kind, and a reminder of artist-designed flowered frame on Ingres' Madame Moitessier in the National Gallery. Note the contrast of matte gilding versus burnished. The latter shows the overlapping leaves. I think if you look carefully at the right-hand enlarged detail, the hollow is showing, which would be burnished, actually shows the stripes where the overlapping gold leaf sheets are double thick, and between them you see the reddish bowl showing through. Also note that Manet and others did not want ornament immediately adjacent to the canvas, as the original 17th century model would have had carving right to the very edge. Indeed, this, if you like, is a bridge between realism and impressionism as this work is considered. Okay.
Paul, I think we're handing over to Lynn here, where that's a lovely segue. Lynn.
Hi. Across the Channel in England, there were already the beginnings of a movement of avant-garde art in reaction to the domination of the Royal Academy, where the annual exhibitions were similar to those of the French Salon, if not quite so floor-to-ceiling, and where the expected types of frame were revivals of French Baroque and neoclassical styles. The pre-Raphaelites were inspired by Ford Madox Brown, their mentor, who had trained in Belgium rather than France and Rome, and who introduced them to the simple frames with linear mouldings and wide friezes used by painters such as Van Eyck and Hans Memling. This launched a very creative period of pioneering frame design in Britain, which lasted from the early 1850s into the first half of the 20th century, and which influenced frame design in Europe. The most important and best known pre-Raphaelite pattern is the Reed and Roundel frame, the one in the center, with a raised border of narrow reeds and geometrical motifs around a frieze which is made out of oak and gilded directly on the wood, giving a much softer and more textured finish compared with the brighter gold which the Academy and the Salon liked. In 1870, France came into conflict with Prussia, leading to an invasion by the Prussian army and the siege of Paris. Both Monet and Pissarro fled to England, Monet to avoid conscription into the army, and Pissarro because his house had been requisitioned by the Prussians and his paintings destroyed. There they were introduced to the dealer Paul Durand-Ruel, another refugee, and the French painter Alphonse Legros, who was a friend of both the Pre-Raphaelites and Whistler. Pissarro later wrote to a friend that Watts, Rossetti strongly interested us amongst the modern men. It was unlikely that Monet could have seen paintings by either on exhibition during the 6 or 7 months he spent in London, although Pissarro had greater opportunities. But the use of us in that quotation indicates that they did see the work of these painters together, and therefore that they almost certainly visited the studios of both Watts and Rossetti. Here they would have found the paintings you can see on this slide, paintings currently finished or being worked on, but they would also have seen their frames, the so-called Watts frame on the left, which is a simplification of a 16th century Italian cassetta, and evidently closely related to the Reed and Roundel frame. Examples of the reeded frame on Rossetti's work, and another type of Rossettian frame on the right, with a sloping frieze, where the ornament has been reduced to 4 decorative roundels. The minimalism and clarity of these designs must have been quite shocking to artists used to the frames in the Paris Salon. They would also have discovered that Whistler and Frederick Leighton painted coloured patterns on their frames, and that Watts used tinted gold leaf to harmonise with his paintings. Can we go to the next slide, please, Matthew? Monet returned to Paris in May 1871 after the end of the war and the uprising it had caused against the French government. Pissarro spent longer in England, returning in 1872. Both of them must then have discussed what they had seen in London with their colleagues, and they must also have experimented with prototype frames, because in 1873, Whistler sent a letter to a friend in which he said that, "I won't let any crafty little Frenchman trespass on my preserves. I am the originator of this kind of coloured decoration on the frame." Colour was an important ingredient in the remaking of the frame. In England, and to Whistler, it had meant painted ornament applied to a gilded surface, but in France it would mean the overall ground colour of the whole frame. The core group of Impressionists combined what they had learned from the structure and lines of Pre-Raphaelite frames with what they read in The Laws of Colour Contrast, a book by Michel Eugène Chevreul, the scientist who directed the dyeing process for tapestries at the Gobelin manufactory. Chevreul suggested that gilded frames acted against the gold, yellow, and orange tones in a painting, and he implied that a white frame did least harm to adjacent colours. The critic Lecan, writing a study of Pissarro in 1890, reported that at the 1877 exhibition, Monsieur Pissarro, applying in its rigorous logic the law of complementary colours, set his canvases into white frames that, without influencing the colours, left the tones with their exact values. No white frames survived from this 1877 exhibition, although they had been used not only by Pissarro, but by Degas, Monet, and Berthe Morisot. However, the drawing of a frame profile from Degas' sketchbook of 1879 to 82, which you can see at the top left, together with a surviving frame on Degas' Danseuse au Repos of 1879, show us something like a white version of Ford Madox Brown's and Rossetti's reeded frames. It gives us an idea of what Pissarro's Côte des Boeufs on the right might have looked like originally when it hung in the third Impressionist exhibition. Something very different from the way it looks now in its dark gold antique frame. They must have had a quite startling effect on the 8,000 or so visitors to the exhibition. One critic dismissed all the white frames on Degas' works as white carved mounts, and another of his attempts at shocking the bourgeoisie. And I think we move on to Paul here.
Right. I don't know if a lot of you will know this museum, the Kimball in Fort Worth. It is a magnificent building and with a terrific collection. I've known it for many years and worked with them since about 1983. Around about the 2000, we were asked by the then Kimball curator to propose a contemporary frame for this magnificent water lily painting by Monet. When you actually look at this carefully, you really wonder, it's not difficult to see the reasons we were asked this when you've been overexposed to this French Rococo frame. It has 8 complex corners and centers fighting for your attention. Truly the art equivalent of cacophony. For example, try listening to a flute that's gently playing with a brass band at full tilt in the background. You cannot look at that picture for very long without getting a headache in this type of frame. Obviously, we have the advantage of seeing the replacement adjacent to it. So it's perhaps tolerable in a French interior of boiseries and furniture, but not in such a blissfully neutral museum space as the Kimball. The fabric-covered inlay with a gilded side edge may look like a step in the right direction, but that is an illusion when you compare the impact of the white gesso Impressionist frame which we supplied. The impact is mesmerizing. You actually see the pictorial richness of the tree and its countless branches, appreciating Monet's unadulterated palette. This is the very setting that Impressionists sought, which was fulfilling the theory of chemist Michel-Eugène Chevreul in his publication, The Laws of Color Contrasting, 1839, that all the primary colors gain by their juxtaposition with white. The frame itself was a great discovery. I think we move to the next slide now, thanks. In a London auction in 2001, apparently cast off an Impressionist painting, its white gesso frieze and reeded gilt half-circle back edge recalled Degas' designs. You can see the alteration offcut here, so the white frieze. This is not white paint, it is gesso, which is absolutely beautiful surface that it brings. And it's a sort of pearlescent, soft, satiny finish. Now, so first thing I'm wondering is, where is the picture? Well, I get to an exhibition 7 years later. I'm face to face with this. I was convinced this had to have been the picture originally made for it. This was Le Gare Saint-Lazare in circa 1885 by the post-impressionist artist Paul Eller, hanging in a Baroque French frame with 16 projecting corners, centers, and demi-centers. One wonders whether they were meant to represent stops on the line. This was loaned to a magnificent exhibition, the Railway Art in the Age of Steam, conceived by Ian Kennedy and Julian Treuherz, first at the Walker Art Gallery, Liverpool, and then the Nelson Atkins Museum, Kansas City, the major US railway hub. The catalogue confirmed canvas size matched our frame rebate identically. How appropriate that Eller painted a subject popular with Monet himself in an Impressionist frame as white as the smoke. This contemporary setting was highly acclaimed at the Kimball. No one had seen a Monet looking so vibrant. However, some 20 years later, the Weeping Willow received a period Louis XIII frame which looks satisfactory, according with frames in Monet's studio. I guess it was the shock of the new factor. Perhaps they could switch them back in the summer. The ensemble, in my view, being an education in itself. This frame's double rejection shows how difficult it was for Impressionists' white or colored frames to survive. Am I next? I'm sure, yes, yeah. This remarkable juxtaposition of one of Degas' most exquisite subjects shows the frame we've just already seen with Lynn on the left and what the owner put on it later when he acquired it. On the survival rate subject we just discussed, the exquisite Degas dancer shown by Lynn being offered in a Sotheby's 1999 sale in its original white artist frame, where it sold for $27,850,000. And again, 9 years later, you see it in this replica Louis XV frame when it fetched $37.04 million, approximately a 32% gain of $20 million. I guess the question arising in what contribution, if any, did the new frame add? And it was commissioned by owner or auctioneer. Was it commissioned by owner or auctioneer? We have assisted auctioneers on many occasions by upgrading frames on works being offered, especially Monet and Renoir, where new buyers stated the frame was what in fact encouraged them to bid. Collectors bidding at auctions are generally influenced by the overall appearance of the artwork. Given the vast evidence of the focusing power of frames, especially French ones, exert on an artwork, and its owner comes as no surprise to us that the presentation was changed, especially for a work of such stratospheric value. To most eyes, Degas' frame would have looked like a temporary setting, awaiting the heavy-duty French treatment we see here to pull you over to the mantelpiece. The corners and centers within gadrooned top edge work well, plus the slip does prevent any gold being adjacent to the subject. Okay.
Lynn, that brings us very nicely. I mean, I just wanted to pause here and say how radical an intervention framing can be. This is a perfect example of how this is almost Thomas Crown Affair stuff. You know, we're ripping a painting out of its frame and subjecting it at times to quite an overbearing intervention in this way. Speaking of which, I'll stop intervening and move swiftly on to Lynn. Sorry, Lynn.
I think Degas would have had something to say about what they did to his dancer.
Yes, he would.
So we come to the coloured Impressionist frames. In the fourth Impressionist exhibition in 1879, both Degas and Mary Cassatt showed paintings in coloured frames. Mary Cassatt was exhibiting for the first time and showed two paintings of women in a red and a green frame, respectively, while Degas also used a green frame for his painting of two friends in a corridor at the Opera House. It has a section similar to the one at the top of this page from his sketchbook, a torus covered with small reeds like half a fluted column. We have another surviving pattern shown here in green from 6 years later in 1885. This is for Degas' painting of a woman stretched out on a towel after a bath, Baigneurs allongés sur sol. It has a structure like several small frames stacked together, which has been covered with white gesso and then painted, giving the colour more intensity and clarity than in the earlier frame, and helping to heighten the warm colours in the painting. The depth of the nested mouldings emphasise the fall of light and shadow on the frame, giving the whole work the illusion of movement, while the parallel lines of the mouldings help the sense of receding space in the painting. These elements are very traditional and are found in 17th century Baroque frames, but the colour transforms them to something very modern. It's a complex process, however. Although Degas' green frame is the complement of the warm reddish-orange floor covering and the fabric in the top left corner, splashes of green are scattered through both these, colour the wall at the top, and slide more subtly into the shading of the flesh. This frame harmonizes as well as contrasting with the colours in the picture. And there was equal disagreement amongst the critics as to exactly what was happening with these painted frames. While Lecan said that Pissarro painted his frames with the complementary of the dominating colour of the painting, the critic Champfleury thought that nature must be framed as she requires, green frames for landscapes, red for dramatic scenes. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here, with a Degas bather from 1886, the artist seems to have moved away completely from any attempt at a use of complementary colour on the frame. The present shade of a warm chestnut brown harmonizes so completely with the woman's hair and sponge, the copper jug, and whatever the hairy thing on the shelf is, that the framed painting is one of the artist's most satisfyingly complete works of art, with the frame totally integrated with the painting. This is another example of the torus profile covered with small reeds. The sketch for it is shown again at the top left. Two sketches beneath it, at the right-hand side of the paper, is a different section with a scooped back edge and a stepped slope from the top edge to the small flat at the side edge. This flat is marked couleur. Below the pages of drawings, you can see an offcut from the frame with exactly this section, with the side edge and the top edge gilded and the steps lacquered a glossy black. Shown together, and bearing in mind the salon frames we saw at the beginning, these two frames alone demonstrate the gulf which had opened between the presentation of official art and the displays now routinely to be seen in the Impressionist exhibitions. The 1886 exhibition was the eighth and last, however, and only Degas, Pissarro, Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt remained of the original group. And the next slide, please. Most of the surviving Impressionist frames belong to Degas, simply because he was particularly good at protecting them. Many people will know the anecdote recounted by the dealer Ambroise Vollard about Degas' extreme touchiness relative to his frames, that when he was invited to dinner with friends and saw that one of his paintings had been reframed, he took the canvas out of the alien frame and walked away, never to be seen again. Pissarro was just as keen as Degas to have his own frames on his work, and he wrestled repeatedly over the years with his dealer, Durand Ruel, trying to get him to accept white frames for exhibition. Finally, in 1883, an exhibition in London turned the tide, and Pissarro was allowed 2 rooms of white frames by Durand Ruel for a show the same year in Paris. The painting on the right may be one remaining example of the oak frames with white margins, which Pissarro had used for an exhibition at the Galerie Georges Petit in Paris. It may originally have been painted white on the frieze with gilded mouldings, or gilded on the frieze with white mouldings. Even as late as the 1880s, with resistance to Impressionist art gradually melting, the frames still had to have enough conventional detail to bind them to other styles or to the interiors of public and commercial galleries. The painting on the left has the single other surviving painted frame by Pissarro, dating from 1882. The novelist J.K. Huysmans, in a review of the 1881 exhibition, had picked out his frames in particular, saying that the series on Pissarro's work, above all, is surprising this year. It's a rainbow of Veronese green, sea green, corn yellow and peach, Amadou fungus brown, and the colour of wine lees, and the delicacy with which the colourist has picked all his tints to make the skies recede and the foregrounds project better must really be seen. It's the keenest refinement, and although the frame can add nothing to the skill of a work, it's nevertheless a necessary complement, an adjunct which shows it off to best advantage. It's analogous to a woman's beauty, which requires the enhancement of fine clothes. None of this extravagance of colour remains to us now. However, this lone white frame in the Fitzwilliam Museum, with its simple cassetta-like structure, has evidently been painted by the artist himself. The frieze has a thick textured coat of off-white, which has been splashed with random brushloads of colour in the greens and ochres used in the painting. Like Degas' coloured frames, this one both harmonises with and complements the colours in the painting, and only Huysmans seems to have realised the complexity of the process. It's nothing like so simple an opposition as the post-Impressionists would later make of it. And I'm passing you back to Paul again.
Paul, this is really rare evidence of original frames, and it's wonderful to highlight these, especially when we put this against the backdrop of Durand Ruel and his interventions here.
Yes, indeed, it is. Paul Durand Ruel is an absolute giant of an art dealer and lived to be a great age, 3 sons, and a very flourishing business. He's often referred to as the godfather of Impressionism and was an ambitious entrepreneur who recognized the artistic and fashionable potential of Impressionism as early as 1870. His first major exhibition of their work took place at his London gallery in 1872. This was followed by organizing the Impressionists' first exhibition in Paris in 1874 in the studios of the celebrated photographer Nadar at 35 Boulevard des Capucines. After a disappointing show in 1875 at the Drouot, showing works by all the Impressionists, one critic writes, "All these paintings have given us the impression of a painting that we must look at 15 paces away, closing our eyes halfway. And if it is certain that we must have a very large apartment to be able to house them. Impressionists sound like a cat walking on the keyboard of a piano, or a monkey grabbing a color box. However, this may be a good deal for those who speculate on the art of the future." In 1876, Durand Ruel set up an exhibition in his own gallery in Rue Le Pelletier. Le Soir Journal reported that exhibits were framed beautifully and at great expense, Well, we're looking at them here on the right, and both sides, a whole group of frames that are really quite serious pieces of work when you come to try making these things molded. One or two of them will be antique, but the ones on the wall hanging too are very fine. Basically, Duraro knew very well that the quality of framing, presentation, etc., was vital for boosting sale potential. Rich clients fell in love with luxurious frames, easily imagining them enhancing their homes and corresponding with French settings. Such frames are displayed in the photographs here, richly ornamented with neo-French styles, including perhaps a few antique. In order to streamline his framing, Duraro used a particular Regency-style pattern shown here on a Pizarro, which is in the National Gallery in Canada. This became a most economic method of producing a kind of livery or gallery frame suitable for various subjects and sizes. My own surveys of all major US museums have revealed over 30 of these frames. As Lynn has described in our book, Frameworks, these composition molded frames had foliate cartouches that were not too intrusively sculptural, finished in a dull bronze, which would have fitted into most interiors without jarring. Further, the dullness of finish is actually a consequence of progressive lighting improvements during the 19th century, requiring bright gold finishes to be toned, color washed or distressed.
Lynn, is this where we credit Monet's subtle revivalism of an earlier style?
Well, I think it's very interesting what happened here, because the Impressionists wanted to fit in and they wanted to sell their work, obviously. And lots of the clients for Impressionist work were Americans, and they fell in love with pictures which were bright and colourful, full of sunlight, often apart from the railway stations and Pizarro's bad weather. But they were cheerful frames and they liked them, and they wanted to take them home to their houses in America. And these were rich men who'd made their fortunes on the railways or through newspapers or through inventing and selling cars. And they had then gone away and built their homes as recreations of 18th century French chateaux in places like Rhode Island. And they filled these houses with late 17th and 18th century Louis furniture, either antique or revivals. And obviously, the pictures would fit in quite well with this, and with sort of printed crotons and things. The frames wouldn't. You couldn't have Pizarro's Veronese green and sea green and corn yellow frames on an Impressionist painting hanging with Louis furniture. It would have been completely out of kilter. So the Impressionists themselves came round to the use of gold frames, but they did it in different ways. Renoir had always liked curly centre and corner French Baroque frames because he saw himself partly as the heir of 18th century Rococo artists. Pizarro kept on grimly hanging on for his white frames with Durand Ruel and writing to his son Lucien right up into the 1890s about it. And Degas just kept his own frames and didn't let anyone do anything at all to his works, except for Count Commando, who we'll come on to later. But Monet, having experimented with white and coloured frames, moved back to gilded frames, but as we can see in this photograph in his studio, they're quite narrow mouldings. They're very linear, very clean, and they have quite small decoration most of the time, fluted or recreations of Louis XIV mouldings, but sort of constricted within the straight lines of the contour. So they're not like the salon frames he was reacting against and the others rejected. And this one, this large painting of the artist's garden at Giverny, has the original frame as we can see it right next door in the black and white photo. I'm sorry it's such bad quality. In Monet's own studio, there is the painting in the frame. And this is sort of, it's a version of a 16th century Baroque Italian, 17th century Baroque Italian frame with a spiral leaf and stave ornament, and this wide frieze going up to the painting with just a small ornament at the side edge. So again, it looks quite clean compared with, for instance, the frame on Olympia. And there's also a sense of playfulness in having this spiral leaf on a painting of a garden. And because the spiral sort of breaks up the gilding, it echoes, as it were, Monet's brushwork. So like Degas' frame with the chestnut colouring and the reeds that goes so well with the bather and her chestnut hair. This again seems to be the artist's choice, melding the frame entirely, completely with the painting. It suits so very well, although it seems to be looking back to an earlier type of frame. It's just a remaking of the gilded frame.
But I do want to bring Mark in here because, Mark, I think this is exactly the type of relationship that informed your decisions about reframing this great water lilies now in the Art Institute in Chicago.
Yes, hi. So the frame on Monet's water lilies to the left here is a handmade replica that we produced from our late 19th century frame, which is a design we now know the artist actually used. That's actually this frame that's, I don't know if anyone can see, but sits behind me, Taurus and the plain site frieze. Anyway, the frame style was discovered when one of our clients brought in his paintings of the Seine at Patouille by Monet in the original model of this frame for reframing. And the client found the frame to be underwhelming and wanted to exchange it for one of our wider traditional Louis XIV corner and center frames. And when we removed the painting from the underwhelming frame, the matching fixture positions revealed that this was actually the first frame to have been fitted to Monet's canvas. So for us, this was a remarkable discovery because since it was an original contemporary Monet-inspired frame of a pattern we'd never seen before. And yeah, it was a great moment. And then the frame itself is a variation of a traditional Louis XIII design, but it's got a plain frieze, possibly part inspired by Degas' architrave frame, adjacent to a torus of molded berry leaves. And yeah, so if we're looking at the slide, now I've turned to the black and white images, and these reveal how the water lily was originally framed, most likely by the art dealer or owner, in a traditional Baroque corner frame by the looks of it. And following the water lily's acquisition by the Art Institute of Chicago, they commissioned us to provide contemporary framing proposals. And the frame you see here was universally approved, which wasn't a surprise when we considered how elegant it looks with its narrow section, plain frieze and foliate ornament that echoes the scale of the lilies.
Hmm. This was a similar process for the railway bridge at Argenteuil, isn't that right?
Yes, yes, it was. So,
trying to get paired back.
yeah, so we were commissioned by Christie's to reframe Monet's 1873 painting of the railway bridge at Argenteuil prior to auction due to its highly unsatisfactory frame. And it's perhaps hard to glean from this image on the left, just because of the scale we're looking at it. But when you see it in life, just how poor the quality was of the previous frame. It was a pastiche of an earlier OG profile frame, but it had cheap gilding, coarse composition ornament, and it was layered in what almost looks like marzipan or talcum powder, giving it an incredibly dull finish. And the grayish slip that they used, well, in this case, it was attempting to echo the bridge and sails, instead just completely distorts Monet's palette. So if we look at the frame just for what it is now, it actually resembles the form of a tea tray. So it's really not doing this painting any justice. And
by Lynn, that one.
And as you can see, the huge corners of the frame, they're also completely destabilize the composition. So it makes it almost impossible to maintain steady contemplation of this vibrant landscape. The corner ornament is also, it dominates our peripheral vision. You can see it's dwarfing the scale of the figures. And fortunately, we could offer Christie's an antique Louis XIII frame that had, just as you can see, bottom right here, that had bunched laurel leaf and berry ornament, retaining its original gilding, which is the most important thing as well, that transformed the presentation of this impressive picture. And the frame it's actually quite similar to Monet's preferred frame style shown previously in the studio on the Artist's Garden at Giverny, which we're looking at with Lynn.
Can I ask Paul, how do the rest of the Impressionists respond to this? How are they reconfiguring with Monet's reintroduction of swathes of gilding and detailing, for instance?
You mean historically? What were they up to?
Yes, I mean we've got this on screens to talk about Degas and Durand-Ruel and this compromise that we're reaching at the end of the 19th century with how pictures are framed. Can you speak to that? Yeah.
It's a good question, but I don't think that they really. I haven't seen some of the other Impressionist work in anything other than the sort of dealer frames that we've seen already, the rudimentary neoclassical moldings in or the kind of marzipan type, bake it in the oven frame we've just been looking at. It's amazing how wrong people got framing. The owners are hardly going to be able to sort something out when they've taken it across the Atlantic, and it's lost its natural sort of starting place, and anything can happen or go wrong. But I've always looked out for an interesting Impressionist frame, and they're the rarest thing of all. There's nothing rare about an Impressionist painting, but frames are almost predictable. But I have to say, the one that Mark was just dealing with, this, the water lily, the one that proved to be the model for the water lilies at Chicago, really was a stunning discovery. The moment the guy brought this in and we put it on the easel, I knew I was looking at the original frame on this painting. It had to be. And it's a pattern that, as we said in the text, nobody's seen before. And we looked at so many places. I reckon you could say fairly enough that if we haven't ever seen it, who on earth has? It may be the only one. It's like that black stepped cutting you saw of the Degas frame, which he shows the drawing of that in the notebooks, the design. We've only ever seen 2 of those. Now that's over 60 years now of looking at frames and buying them, you know, putting your money where your mouth is. You get to know these things. And we've only ever seen 2. So we certainly kept the cutting of this one. But I suppose if that is the question you've asked could be a more extended answer. But so many of these experimental frames and colored frames they were using will have just disappeared. We have only one other white frame in our huge inventory, and it's just a white plank of wood that's gesso. That's it. And you can't see too many people rushing to acquire it, but maybe this will make them have second thoughts.
We've got many dozens of people who've tuned in for this, and I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting to see that frame.
Well,
but I wanted to ask Mark then, there's another reason why we've got so few Impressionist frames surviving, or so few original frames surviving, because of collectors' tastes as well, like Count Commando in Paris.
Yeah, so I'll just look at this. As Lynn discussed earlier, Degas gave great consideration into designing his own frames, and he was very protective over them. Hence, actually, his fallout with his friend who replaced the frame on one of his pictures, and he then Degas met him at his house and actually took the painting out of the frame and walked away with it, and then they never actually, I don't think they talked again. So we know how protective he was, but we also know that the plain painted frames of the Impressionists didn't fit in with the interior decor of most collectors at this time. So it made it much harder for dealers to sell their work, as we've sort of been alluding to. And as a result, one of Degas' key patrons, Count Isaac de Commando, created his own frame design, most probably in collaboration with Degas, which later became known as the Commando frame. And the austere classicism of this design fitted easily into 18th century interiors. And it fitted actually into the interior, as we can see here, of Count Commando's house. And this photo of his interior, taken in 1910, shows this very frame on all his works by Degas. And the frame comprises elements of a sort of Louis XVI neoclassical pattern, but with the fluting instead of twisted ribbon, and Degas' plain architrave design. There were also variations of this frame where the inner frieze was left ungilded, exposing the white gesso for its supposed neutrality according to Chevreul's color theories, as Lynn was discussing earlier. And if we look closely at the black and white image of Count Commando's interior here, you can see 3 examples of these frames with white side borders.
I'll point one out for you here.
Not that easy to see, but yeah, there we go.
2 in the distance that actually do their job brilliantly in that half light at the back of the room, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do.
And so going back to the other point is that this design in general was also more acceptable to a 19th century French collector, since the frame is gilded with classical elements. And although actually you don't see many of these frames these days, the original frames can still be seen on several paintings in the Musée d'Orsay. And we are also fortunate to own 2 original Commando frames, one of which was the model for a handmade reproduction for the National Gallery's Degas After the Bath, illustrated on the right. And I've got them behind me, but basically here is one of them.
And they vary between a very subtle centered motif, like the one that you did for the National Gallery. I should point that out because we're talking with such pared back moldings, incredible subtleties where the ribbons meet at the center of the frame. And then others, like this example you have with Christie's in 2019, where the ribbon is one continuous band.
Yeah, exactly.
And which is also shown in at least one of the Camondo frames on the left.
Yep, that's right.
But this is quite a dramatic contrast to this smorgasbord of images you prepared for us, Mark, which is just a feast and a salad for the eyes, I have to say.
Right. Well, I mean, I'll start by, I suppose, introducing this slide. So frames used by Durand-Ruel and Camondo, seen in the last two slides, were generally deemed inadequate by American collectors of Impressionist works. And I'm sort of probably might be repeating a little of what Lynn was actually saying, but many of them were wealthy entrepreneurs who built Renaissance and French sort of chateau-style mansions. And these modern works had to fit in with their predominantly French interiors and be framed accordingly. And hence dealers and collectors framed Impressionist works occasionally with genuine, but usually reproduction pastiche Louis XIV, Régence, and Louis XV frames that were intended to harmonize with their interiors. However, many of these frames were designed to house portraits and therefore didn't necessarily harmonize with other genres that were also being put in them. Because the Impressionists invariably painted landscape on portrait format canvases, conveniently fitting the plentiful supply of secondhand historical portrait frames that was by far the largest genre at this time. And this is what allowed for this mismatch to occur. So getting to the point of the slide now, this slide comprises photos I've taken of Impressionist paintings in American museums that will have mainly been donated or acquired in these frames. So this is, it's not something the curators have changed and put on. This is how they've arrived. And as you can see, the frames all have large corner and center ornament that draw your eye to the right focal points for portraiture, but they have little relevance on these landscapes and seascapes. And to sort of, if you sort of step back a bit and look really take it in, you can see that these heavy ornaments instead overpower and really visually distract the balanced compositions, and our contemplation is completely disturbed by these attention-seeking surrounds. And I sympathize with curators wishing to upgrade to more aesthetically satisfying frames, because I know a lot of them would like to, and I'm not necessarily in quite a few museums, and I know that they face this issue, but they also face challenges. For example, the original donor may stipulate they want these frames to remain, or if they get past that, then when a painting hangs in groups, multiple frames would require changing. So that makes.
You've had great successes, though, both individually and with long-standing relationships with institutions. And this, I thought, was a particular success.
Yes. So our company we have sort of over the years collaborated with like-minded curators over the years and managed to reframe various Impressionist pictures for museums. And yeah, this is one of my favorite examples, is the reframing of Manet's Ship Deck for the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. Since I think it really illustrates the dramatic transformation a frame can have on a painting. Because as with many of the Impressionist paintings, and similar to others illustrated on the last slide, this painting was, I would say, shackled in a highly decorative Louis XV style frame that was originally designed for an 18th, 19th century portrait, as mentioned before. So where the scale of the sitter would be appropriate for the size of the corner and center cartouches, Whereas here, one feels like the ribbing, feels like the rigging could get caught up in the sort of the frame's ornaments if we look closely at it. It's just completely throwing you off the composition. So we supply the National Gallery of Victoria with a 19th century neoclassical revival salon frame. And that's the style my father was discussing in the earlier slides, that Manet and his fellow Impressionists were also noted for using, and especially as their careers went on. And yeah, I mean, the frame not only complements, but I would say it enhances the composition.
It completely liberates the painting, doesn't it?
It does, and that is the power of the frame, and that is what the frame is there for. That is its job, and it's not until we really sort of see that. Quite often I've used before and afters, you really appreciate how important a frame is. That's what drew me into this business, because I didn't appreciate the effect a frame will have on a painting until I had the before and after next to each other, and then the penny drops. And yeah, again, it complements, but it not only complements, it enhances, and I'd say it's the concave profile that really, in this case, draws your eye into the perspective whilst providing a classical setting. And that is what a lot of these salon profiles did, is that they have this concave profile with no ornament, at least in the frieze, if you will, that, again, doesn't distract. It just allows you to enjoy the painting, and especially if it's a landscape or a still life.
It is almost 6:10, and before I let everybody rush off to a well-deserved gin and tonic if they're anywhere in the same time zone as London, or breakfast if they're not, Paul, I just wondered if you could finish off and round out this conversation with a look at where I think you feel the greatest collection of original and early frames lie.
Yes, I just add, well done, Mark. I thought you got that sorted very nicely. What I didn't butt in to say was that this National Gallery of Victoria, Melbourne, which is such a wonderful gallery.
Let me go back.
With an extremely, go-ahead team running it. They have actually got 3 Manets, and we managed to reframe all 3. And Manet was pretty fussy about his frames, thank goodness. I mean, he used a lot of neoclassical patterns like this, and 1 or 2 absolutely special ones. So I felt it was one of those hat tricks that's not likely to happen again. Let's see where we are now. And I would start off by repeating what I said at the beginning, is that the d'Orsay, to my mind, we've seen pretty well every museum worth looking at, has always had exceptional frames and framing, as these examples show. The Manet on the top left, for the actual structure of the painting and its slenderness, this is just the perfect width of section. First of all, it's not too light, it isn't too heavy, it's exquisitely ornamented. It's a revival style salon pattern that's enriched with appropriately feminine bindings around it, you notice, and it may well have in fact been specially commissioned by the d'Orsay, but it gets top marks from me. The Monet in the center we've already discussed. It's a particularly successful frame to use for his work, because you also, in this particular subject, you can't help thinking that if Big Ben actually rang, it would get all these spirals sort of rattling. The whole picture would be generally shivering. A sort of technical detail I'd like to bring up about this is that we had a frame like this in about 2001, which I bought in Paris in a sale. It was not anything made in the 19th century. It was an 18th century French Louis XVI frame. The use of a spiral rod leaf is not very often seen in frames, but this was a fabulous object, and it was sold to a distinguished dealer who hadn't been able to find it from his usual source, and he was more than delighted to see this. We're busy trying to find the details of it before, but it would be nice to see, because this isn't the kind of frame that you would normally expect to see being made even by the 19th century framers. The fluted frame on the Saint-Lazare is absolutely perfect for it. Again, the sort of racket that must be going on in the station, the sort of noise and so on, is going to be accentuated by the flutes, those light scattering flutes. And as we mentioned before, they, if you produce that ornament in a hollow section, it collides at the corner into a rather unpleasant looking number of sort of lines at right angles. So they always placed an acanthus leaf over the corner to mask the junction. And in fact, what that does too, usefully, is suggest diagonals running across the picture, which in this case, with the apex of the roof, is even more important. He may well have chosen the frame for the corners as much as anything else. Now, the Caillebotte, such an interesting artist. I've made my notes here on its absolute wonderful first sighting of this pattern. I suspect it's probably a modern design combining an outer plain scotia with the steps from the Degas sketchbook I was talking about a moment ago. But I'd love to get in to see the d'Orsay people, or we'll find out a bit more about it. Maybe Lynn has the answer and she's holding it up her sleeve. I'm not sure.
Sorry, no.
Well,
I don't know where it came from, but I just think it works so well on this painting.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think it's designed to do just what it does best, is to produce this huge vanishing point and perspective with the boat. You really do sort of rattle along in that. It's about as smart a piece of framing as you'd ever get to see. But I've never ever seen the frame anywhere else. So, however, talking of plain molded frames, which we're very fond of, all frames or any type have to start off life having a molding made, the actual structure of the frame, before there's any ornamentation going in. And nothing is purer than the one here. I can't see the bottom of
the Pizarro, Soleil du Matin.
Yes, it's an exquisite thing to my mind. And it's an extraordinary coincidence that only in 2 weeks ago, a frame auction in London, we have bought just one of those exact ones from Richard Green's sale. And it shows his good taste in framing, apart from anything else. But now we've got it, but we've had them before, but they are simply the Louis XVI profile that's made, first of all, before it gets ornamented. And the usual ornamentation of that would be flutes in the hollow section here and carved leaves along the sight edge, possibly even beading at the step. So it's got a fair number of options that could happen to it. And if anybody cared to look up the section, it's in Lynn and our History of European Frames, page 45, plate 32, G. It just shows that plain section as the beginning of all the variations of it, because we've got at least 4 different ways that frame could be treated.
I was just actually holding this up because we happen to have this, but where you've just got the
is that
leaf molding it. But
the one we were talking about?
You're just showing off
Another
now.
variation. Sorry, it's just because I honestly had it out.
Well,
earlier.
no, it is. I hadn't thought, considering we only bought it, it only
No, this is a
arrived in
different
our
one. It's a different one
company
that I had
2
out because I
weeks
was showing
ago.
it
We
quite
might
early.
as well show you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, given that we have called on everyone's time for an hour and a quarter, and they've done amazingly well to stay with us, we should applaud them. But I also want to applaud you three for your time and expertise in this talk, which has been fascinating for me. I've made copious notes myself, and we have had some questions in, and I just wanted to briefly run through those. We've been asked to recommend a book regarding the history of frames and anything on Impressionist frames. Well, can I just plug the speakers here and say you've got to rush out and buy either a history of European picture frames or frameworks, form, function, and ornament in European portrait frames, both I think from 1996, but which are
The latter is a bit pretty much not being. We don't have. There are no more. I think you can find maybe 1 or 2 copies online, but the history of European picture frames there. Wait, that's actually something you can get from us. We have copies.
These are still Bibles that are indispensable and should be available in any reputable library if there are any left. And
there's also this on Impressionist frames.
Impressionist frames.
Yes, that's what I'm holding up.
We've all got
de
it.
peintre.
Oh, right. Oh, where's mine? Well done. Well done, everyone. Snap.
This is Isabel Kahn's wonderful catalogue with drawings on the back.
There's a start, but also I'd recommend everybody check out the Frame blog as well. This is the National Gallery publication, isn't it? How to Look at Frames.
This Nicholas Penny, a serious frame enthusiast, has written some wonderful articles about frames in the Burlington magazine. But what's more, produced at least 3 beautifully produced and written guides on frames. It's just what it says it is, a pocket guide on frames, but it's absolutely packed with information. And it would be a very nice starting place because you could hold it in your hand while you're going around looking at the paintings, and nobody ever looks at the frames until you suddenly remind them to or point something out. So,
well, you're right, Paul. In a way, it's a call to arms, because one part of it is trying to find relevant literature on picture frames that we can all digest, because actually some of it, forgive me, but some of it is difficult to understand. When you say Louis XVI, okay, maybe we know that that's late 18th century, but maybe we don't. Or Taurus, Belection. These are kinds of phrases and expressions and nomenclature which a lot of people won't get. And so part of it is finding good literature like these examples that spell it out very clearly. But part of it is also we all need to lobby our local, national, international museums and institutions to tell us more. So, for instance, the National Gallery did at one point, many years ago, have labels about all of the frames in the collection, but these were removed again. And
well, curators don't like labels, you see. Apparently they don't. This is what I've been told. And so you get a caption with the minimum about the painting. Those have had to be expanded because now people don't know the Bible and they don't know classical mythology. So they have to be told what's happening in the painting. So there isn't any room left to tell you what happens around the outside of the painting.
But there are surely ways of doing it by highlighting particularly important examples of frames in a collection, or having a color-coded scheme or a map or a...
Sure.
And, you know, there's
well, yes, because
got to
I
be
think
ways.
that's what the Prado has just done. They've got a sort of a pathway through the museum where they pick out, they highlight important frames and they tell you about them. And they've made a video of it as well, which is great.
Is that available on their website, Lynn?
Yes, it is.
Okay, fantastic.
There are several parts to it. So you can look at the group of highlighted frames and you can see the video, but I'm afraid it's all in Spanish.
I think that's www.prado.es, isn't it? Their website. But either way, a Google search will get you there. I have a couple of other questions. In fact, one particularly good one here. I wonder if a person looking at a cropped painting, i.e. Degas, would question whether the frame is eliminating part of the picture. Do we look at paintings and ask, oh, is this frame the right size? Well, I know I do, but what are the answers to that?
I think you have to go back to Turner when he started producing round paintings. They're called vortical paintings, sort of near the end of his career. And what he was trying to do was to replicate what the eye saw. So obviously, if you think about the edge of your vision from both eyes, it's stereoscopic, but it actually makes the circle, which picks out what you really see of the world. And that's what he was reproducing. And I think Degas was kind of doing the same thing. He was cutting off the edges of things where what was going on had crept, as it were, to the side of you. He was trying to make an immediate picture of what the eye saw very cleverly. So you get these pictures where he's got someone standing in the middle of a French square and there's masses of ground going up to the person standing there. And then other things where people are coming in are cut off at the edges. And this one is particularly interesting because it's got this high viewpoint. It's the person looking down as a voyeur on the girl bathing. And everything is sort of at an angle, and it's giving you the sort of intense focus of the vision on the woman washing.
You're right. This is an absolutely remarkable frame, which feels like a piece of adjunct furniture that you could just lean on and look out over.
Yes, it's as though you're looking through a trapdoor at her or something, in some way. It's
fantastic. That frame, we have one or two of these, and they're in mahogany.
Oh.
Or he could have painted, made it in a lighter wood and stained it, but there's no reason why everything has to be gilded. It's such a good match with the palette.
It's perfect, isn't it? I think it probably was painted to match. I don't think you get such a close correspondence.
It's a bit of both, I think, Lynn, but it's. I mean, we've even got one or two of these cushion frames with the reading, with there's still a sort of traces of green paint over them. Mark, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
and that looks
almost something like that.
Yes, I mean it's just you can see them that they've at one point been painted over to get a sort of confluence of the two colours. But
the one in the Dorsey is the one I referred to of Portrait des Amis sur Seine, the very famous one, where you can see that he's painted the wood and the paint has kind of been absorbed into the wood as it were. So it's not such a clear green as this one. This, because it's on top of gesso, has got a much more homogeneous surface, so to speak. But this other one is like the ones you're talking about, and I don't think that could have been mahogany. It's more likely to have been pine, I suppose, or possibly poplar or chestnut.
Well, could be.
On this subject, or rather to round out the talk this evening, I'd just like to say thank you again to our speakers, Lynn Roberts, Paul Mitchell and Mark Mitchell. I'm very grateful that you've taken your time to be with us this evening, as I am to you participants who have been with us for almost an hour and a half. This has got to be a record for a London Art Week Art History in Focus talk. I promise we won't try and beat that record in future, but I want to draw your attention to tomorrow's talk at 5 p.m, which is entitled Fruit of Friendship, Portraits by Mary Beale. That is going to be a fabulous talk, and it's between Ellie Smith, researcher at Philip Mould and Company, and the Dulwich Picture Gallery curator, Lucy West, who are discussing Mary Beale as an artist, writer, businesswoman, and her triumph against the odds. It's moderated by Christopher Baker, who is the new editor of the Burlington magazine, and I think that's going to be wonderful. One more, I should say, in the on the immediate horizon is Andrew Graham Dixon's talk at Strawberry Hill, which will be on the 17th of May, and you can find all of that information on the London Art Week website. For now, it just remains for me to say thank you all and have a lovely evening. And that if you're in London or anywhere nearby, that gin and tonic awaits. Take care, everybody, and have a lovely evening.